The air trembled with the deafening roar of the crowd. Cheers, jeers, and primal screams crashing together like a violent storm. This was Denver 9's arena, a pit where the desperate wagered their lives for a fleeting chance at survival. Jace Carver never imagined he'd end up here. But now he stood in the heart of this nightmare, surrounded by predators and lost souls, faced with a single choice: save her or walk away and let fate decide. Her eyes, golden, burning like twin suns lost in the void, locked onto his, not with fear, not with a plea, but with defiance, daring the universe itself to do its worst. And in that moment, something inside Jace ignited. He couldn't let her die here. But saving Kaera meant going against Valthor, one of the most ruthless slavers in the galaxy. And once Jace made his move, there was no turning back. This wasn't just a fight for survival. This was the beginning of a firestorm. A rogue pilot and a forgotten warrior, ready to set the stars ablaze in their battle for freedom. If you love thrilling sci-fi stories, high-stakes space battles, and deep, compelling characters, then hit that subscribe button now. Jace and Kaera's journey is just beginning, and countless dangers, mysteries, and enemies lie ahead. Don't miss the next chapter. Subscribe now and be part of the adventure. Rocket fire. The air on Denver 9 hit Jace Carver like a fist, thick with the acrid tang of molten ore, red dust swirling in clouds that stung his eyes and coated his throat. Beneath his boots, the ground thrummed with the dull roar of mining rigs churning endlessly below the surface, their vibrations rattling up through the cracked stone floor of the underground arena. Flickering red lights dangled from rusted chains overhead, casting jagged shadows across a crowd of aliens, scaled brutes, insectoid traders, and wiry scavengers, all crammed shoulder to shoulder, their voices a chaotic symphony of growls, hisses, and guttural cheers. The stench of sweat, spilled liquor, and scorched metal hung heavy, a miasma that clung to everything like a second skin. This wasn't a place for the weak. It was a crucible where hope came to die, and credits flowed like blood. Jace adjusted the frayed collar of his jacket, the leather worn thin from years of drifting through the galaxy's underbelly. At 30, he carried the weight of a man twice his age, black hair mussed and streaked with dust, gray eyes sharp but shadowed by ghosts he couldn't outrun. He'd been a pilot once, a damn good one, flying for the Coalition until he'd refused an order that would have turned a civilian colony to ash. That choice cost him everything: his rank, his ship, his purpose. Now, the Stellar Fong, his last tether to that life, sat impounded in some backwater dock, and he was here, in this hellhole, chasing credits to buy it back. One good bet, that's all he needed. One fight to tip the scales. He elbowed through the crowd, ignoring the glares of a reptilian thug whose tail flicked irritably against his leg. The arena's pit loomed ahead, a sunken circle of cracked stone ringed by jagged metal spikes, stained dark with the blood of countless losers. A hulking beast, some kind of six-legged predator with claws like scythes, paced inside, its roars shaking the air. Jace's stomach tightened. He'd seen fights like this before, brutal, fast, and rarely fair. He wasn't here to watch, though. He was here to play the odds, to turn a handful of credits into a fortune. That was the plan, until she appeared. The crowd's noise spiked as a gate screeched open, and a figure stumbled into the pit. She was small, almost fragile against the beast's bulk, but there was something about her that made Jace freeze. Her skin shimmered a deep violet, faint bioluminescent patterns pulsing beneath the surface like dying embers. Long white hair, matted with grime, spilled over her shoulders, catching the red light in a way that made it glow like starfire. She wore little more than tattered rags, her arms and legs bare, marked with bruises and old scars that told a story of pain she'd never voice. A thick metal collar clamped around her throat, its edges digging into her flesh, and her hands gripped a crude metal rod, her only defense. But it was her eyes that stopped him cold, golden, luminous, burning with a quiet defiance even as her body swayed from exhaustion. Cathan female, a voice boomed over the arena's speakers, oily and amplified, cutting through the din, last of her kind, unbroken and untamed, perfect for the pits or your private collection. The speaker was Valthor, a towering figure perched on a platform above the pit. His skin gleamed a sickly gray, one arm replaced by a gleaming cybernetic claw that clicked menacingly as he gestured. His eyes, small and beady, glinted with greed beneath a brow studded with metal studs. "Step up, scum of the galaxy. Bid now or watch her bleed." The beast lunged, and the woman, Kaera, as the flickering sign above her gate declared, dodged with a grace that belied her battered state. Her rod cracked against its flank, drawing a snarl, but the crowd only laughed, betting on how long she'd last. Jace's hands clenched at his sides. He'd heard of the Cathan, warriors of a lost race, wiped out in the war's early days, their cities reduced to ash by coalition bombs. The galaxy said they were extinct. Yet here she was, fighting not for glory but for survival, a ghost thrown into a pit to amuse monsters. He should have walked away. He had no credits to spare, no reason to care. But when Kaera stumbled, blood dripping from a gash on her arm, and her eyes flicked upward, not pleading, not broken, but daring the world to finish her, something snapped inside him. Memories of his squad, of the colony he couldn't save, burned behind his eyes. He couldn't save them, but maybe, just maybe, he could save her. The bidding started, numbers flying fast, 10,000, 20, 50. Yatzis gut twisted. His entire stash, scraped from months of odd jobs, barely hit 5,000. Valthor's claw tapped the platform, his grin widening as the bids climbed into absurdity. "Come now," he sneered. "A rarity like this deserves more. We'll claim the prize." Jace stepped forward, shoving past a slimy traitor who hissed in protest. 5,000, he called, voice steady despite the sweat beading on his brow. "And a debt. Name your terms." The crowd hushed, then erupted in jeers. Valthor's beady eyes narrowed, scanning him like a predator sizing up prey. "A human," Valthor chuckled, the sound wet and grating. 5,000 in a debt? You're either brave or stupid, meat. What's your collateral?" Jace met his gaze, unflinching. "My hands. My skills. You'll get your credits, one way or another." It was a lie, mostly. He had no intention of paying Valthor a damn thing beyond tonight. But the bluff held. Valthor's claw clicked, then slammed down. "Sold. To the fool in the jacket." The crowd roared, some amused, some furious, but Jace ignored them. He vaulted over the pit's edge, boots thudding onto the blood-stained stone. The beast was already being dragged back, its handlers cursing as it snapped at their prods. Kaera stood still, rod dangling limply in her hand, her chest heaving with shallow breaths. Up close, she was smaller than he'd thought, her frame delicate yet wiry, like a blade tempered by fire. Jace crouched, reaching for the collar around her throat. His fingers brushed her skin, soft, impossibly smooth despite the dirt, warm where it met the cold metal. She didn't flinch, didn't pull away, just watched him with those golden eyes, unreadable but piercing. His breath caught as he worked the clasp, the heat of her skin lingering on his fingertips longer than it should have. The collar clattered to the ground, and he moved to the shackles on her wrists, her pulse thrumming faintly beneath his touch. "You're free," he said, voice low, rougher than he intended. "If you'll come with me." She didn't respond, didn't move, but when he stood and offered his hand, her fingers, slender, trembling, brushed his palm. The contact sent a jolt through him, her skin cool yet alive, like a whisper of something he couldn't name. Above, Valthor's voice cut through the haze. "Enjoy your prize, human, while you can. She's mine again when you can't pay." The threat hung heavy, but Jace didn't look back. He pulled Kaera close, her shoulder pressing against his chest, her hair grazing his jaw, soft, tangled, carrying a faint warmth that cut through the arena's filth. The crowd parted as he led her out, her weight leaning into him just enough to make his heart pound. He'd bet everything on a stranger. And as her golden eyes flicked to his, a spark of something, gratitude, defiance, maybe both, lit within them, Jace knew there was no turning back. The tunnels beneath Drenver. Nine swallowed Jace Carver and Kaera like a beast gullet, the air thick with choking red dust that coated their lungs and stung their eyes. The walls, rough-hewn stone veined with glowing ore, pulsed faintly under the dim flicker of emergency lights bolted haphazardly into the rock. The distant rumble of mining rigs echoed through the maze, a low growl that vibrated up through Jace's boots, mingling with the sharper, more immediate snarl of engines behind them. Valther's hunters were closing in, hulking vehicles armored in black steel, their plasma rifles spitting molten streaks that carved glowing scars into the tunnel walls. Jace's pulse hammered in his ears, a rhythm of adrenaline and desperation as he yanked Kaera forward, her wrist gripped tight in his calloused hand. "Move!" he barked, voice hoarse over the chaos. She stumbled but kept pace, her bare feet slapping the uneven stone, her ragged breaths barely audible beneath the roar of pursuit. The tunnel twisted sharply ahead, a jagged split in the rock offering a fleeting chance to lose their tail. Jace veered left, dragging Kaera into the narrower passage, the walls scraping his shoulders as he shoved through. Behind them, a plasma bolt slammed into the entrance they'd just cleared, sending a shower of molten rock raining down. The tunnel shuddered, dust cascading like a crimson fog, and Jace swore under his breath. They weren't just being hunted, they were being herded. He risked a glance at Kaera. Her violet skin glistened with sweat, the faint bioluminescence beneath it flickering like a dying flame. Her white hair clung to her face in damp strands, framing those golden eyes that burned with a quiet intensity. Exhausted, yes, but not broken. She hadn't spoken since the arena, hadn't resisted his pull, but her fingers tightened around his with a strength that surprised him. Her touch was cool, her skin smooth despite the grime, and it sent a jolt up his arm, a distraction he couldn't afford but couldn't shake. The tunnel widened into a cavernous chamber, its ceiling lost in shadow, stalactites dripping with mineral-rich water that plinked in shallow pools below. Rusted machinery littered the space, old drills and broken carts abandoned by miners long gone. Jace scanned the room, his mind racing. They needed cover, a bottleneck, anything to slow Valther's dogs. His eyes locked on a narrow chute in the far wall, a ventilation shaft half hidden by a toppled cart. It was a long shot, but it was all they had. He pulled Kaera toward it, ducking behind the cart as the whine of engines grew louder. "Stay low," he hissed, shoving her down beside him. Her shoulder pressed against his chest, her body trembling faintly. Not from fear, he realized, but from sheer exhaustion. Up close, she smelled of dust and something faintly sweet, like the ghost of a flower buried under the planet's filth. Her hair brushed his jaw, soft and tangled, and he felt the heat of her skin through the thin fabric of her rags. His hand lingered on her arm, steadying her, and for a split second, he forgot the danger barreling toward them. The first vehicle burst into the chamber, its headlights slicing through the dust, a hulking silhouette of steel and menace. Two more followed, their riders scaled brutes with cybernetic implants, dismounting with rifles raised. Jace's stomach tightened. 3 against 2, and one of his two could barely stand. He slid his knife from its sheath, the blade dull but sharp enough for close work, and pressed himself tighter against the cart. Kaera's breath hitched, her body shifting closer, her thigh brushing his as she adjusted her crouch. The contact sent a shiver through him, her warmth seeping into his side, and he gritted his teeth to refocus. "Human," one of the hunters bellowed, voice amplified by a vocal modulator. "Surrender the Cathan, and we might let you crawl out of here alive." The others laughed, a harsh, grating sound that bounced off the cavern walls. Jace didn't bother answering. Words wouldn't stop them, only blood would. He waited until the nearest hunter, a broad-shouldered beast with a metal jaw, stepped within range, then lunged. The knife sank into the gap between armor plates, and the brute roared, swinging a clawed fist that grazed Jace's shoulder. He twisted, driving the blade deeper, and the hunter crumpled, blood pooling black in the red dust. The others opened fire, plasma bolts sizzling past, one singeing the cart's edge with a burst of sparks. Jace dove back, slamming into Kaera, who caught his arm to steady him. Her fingers dug into his bicep, cool and firm, and her eyes met his, wide, alert, a silent question he couldn't answer. "We're not dying here," he growled, more to himself than her. He grabbed her hand again, pulling her toward the chute. The shaft was tight, its rusted metal walls slick with condensation, but it was their only way out. He shoved her in first, her slim frame slipping through with a scrape of fabric against steel. She turned, reaching back for him, and he followed, squeezing his broader shoulders through the gap as another bolt slammed into the cart behind them. The shaft sloped downward, a claustrophobic tube that smelled of damp, rot, and old air. Jace's boots skidded on the slick surface, his hands bracing the walls as he half slid, half crawled after Kaera. Her silhouette moved ahead, lit faintly by the glow of her skin, a beacon in the dark. The tunnel shook again, louder this time, a deep groan reverberating through the stone. Yatsiskutzunk. They weren't just shooting now. They were bringing the whole damn place down. "Faster!" he shouted, voice echoing. Kaera stumbled, her foot catching on a jutting rivet, and she fell forward, tumbling into him. Their bodies collided, her back slamming against his chest, and for a heartbeat they were tangled, her hair in his face soft and wild, her frame pressed so close he could feel the rapid rise and fall of her ribs. His arms wrapped around her instinctively, one hand splaying across her stomach, the other gripping her shoulder. Her skin was smooth, warm beneath the thin cloth, and the heat of her seeped into his palms, electric and disorienting. She twisted in his hold, golden eyes locking with his, so close he could see the flecks of amber swirling within them. Her breath brushed his lips, hot and ragged, and something tightened in his chest, a pull he didn't have time to name. The tunnel bucked violently, snapping him back. A deafening crack split the air as the ceiling behind them collapsed, dust and debris roaring down the shaft. Jace tightened his grip, hauling Kaera forward as the chute narrowed, forcing them to crawl belly down through the choking haze. Her elbow grazed his side, her hip pressed against his as they scrambled, every movement a brush of warmth that made his pulse race faster than the danger warranted. The shaft spat them out into another cavern, smaller this time, its walls glittering with unmined or that cast faint green light across the space. Jace rolled onto his back, gasping, Kaera collapsing beside him. Her chest heaved, her arm flung across his stomach as she caught her breath, and he didn't push her away. The weight of her was grounding, her skin cool where it touched his through the rips in his shirt. He turned his head, meeting her gaze. She was a mess, dust streaking her face, hair plastered to her cheeks. But those eyes burned brighter now, alive with something new. Gratitude? Trust? He couldn't tell, but it stirred something in him he hadn't felt in years. A sharp pain flared in his shoulder, and he hissed, glancing down. Blood soaked his sleeve, a shallow gash from the hunter's claw seeping red. Before he could react, Kaera sat up, her movements shaky but deliberate. She tore a strip from her already tattered shirt, exposing a sliver of her midriff, smooth, violet skin that caught the green light like a gem. She knelt beside him, her fingers brushing his arm as she wrapped the fabric around the wound. Her touch was light, trembling slightly, but steady enough to tie a knot. The graze of her fingertips sent a shiver up his spine, her coolness a stark contrast to the heat of his blood, and when she pressed the makeshift bandage down, her palm lingered, warm now, as if drawing life from him. "You didn't have to do that," he muttered, voice rougher than he meant it to be. She didn't answer, just looked at him, really looked at him, her golden eyes softening for the first time. Her hand slid down his arm, resting briefly on his wrist, and the contact was fleeting but heavy, a silent tether in the dark. The distant hum of engines vibrated through the stone, fainter now, but still there. Valthor wasn't done with them. Jace pushed himself up, wincing, and offered his hand again. "We're not safe yet. Come on." Kaera took it, her fingers curling into his with a strength that belied her fragile frame, her skin soft and alive against his calluses. As he pulled her to her feet, her body brushed his, close, too close, and the warmth of her lingered, a quiet promise that whatever came next, they'd face it together. The escape pod shuddered as it broke through Denver 9's atmosphere, its hull groaning under the strain of a ascent fueled by desperation and jury-rigged thrusters. Jace Carver gripped the controls, his knuckles white against the cracked console, the faint glow of warning lights painting his face in shades of red and amber. Beside him, Kaera sat strapped into the co-pilot's seat, her violet skin dulled by exhaustion, her white hair spilling over her shoulders like a cascade of starlight dulled by dust. The pod rattled as it cleared the planet's pull, spitting them into the cold void of space, where the silence was a stark contrast to the chaos they'd left behind. Ahead, a derelict space station loomed, a skeletal relic orbiting the planet, its jagged silhouette framed against the endless black, dotted with the faint gleam of distant stars. Jace exhaled, a slow release of tension that did little to ease the ache in his shoulder or the weight in his chest. The station was their only shot, a forgotten outpost abandoned after the war, its corridors littered with the husks of shattered ships and broken dreams. If they could hide there, patch the pod, maybe they'd buy enough time to figure out what came next. He glanced at Kaera, her golden eyes fixed on the viewport, unblinking, as if she could see something he couldn't. She hadn't spoken since the mines, but her presence, quiet, steady, filled the cramped pod in a way he couldn't ignore. Her hand rested on the armrest, fingers curled slightly, and he fought the urge to reach for it, to feel that cool, smooth skin against his again. The pod docked with a jarring clang, its clamps latching onto a rusted airlock with a hiss of pressurized air. Jace unbuckled, wincing as his wounded shoulder protested, and kicked the hatch open. The station's interior greeted them with a blast of stale, frigid air, the kind that seeped into your bones and stayed there. Dim emergency lights flickered along the walls, casting long shadows across a floor strewn with debris, shattered glass, twisted metal, and the skeletal remains of a fighter craft half buried under a collapsed bulkhead. The viewport dominated one wall, cracked but intact, offering a fractured view of the stars that spilled silver light across the space. "Stay close," Jace muttered, drawing his knife, the only weapon he had left. Kaera nodded, a small, almost imperceptible motion, and followed as he moved deeper into the station. Her footsteps were silent, her bare feet brushing the cold floor, and he couldn't help but notice how small she seemed here, dwarfed by the vastness of the ruin. Yet there was a strength in her, a resilience that kept her upright when anyone else would have broken. He didn't know her story, didn't know what she'd endured to end up in that pit, but he felt it in the way she moved, like a flame refusing to gut her out. They reached a control room, its consoles dark and dust-covered, a single screen flickering with static. Jace set to work, prying open a panel with his knife, his fingers deft despite the stiffness in his joints. "If I can get this running, we might have a chance," he said, more to fill the silence than anything else. Kaera stood beside him, her shadow falling across the console, and for the first time, she spoke. "They won't stop." Her voice was low, rough from disuse, like gravel scraped over silk. Jace froze, the knife hovering mid-cut, and turned to her. Her golden eyes met his, steady but shadowed, carrying a weight that made his throat tighten. "Who won't?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "Valthor." The bastard wouldn't let his prize slip away so easily. Kira's lips parted, hesitating. Then she stepped closer, close enough that he could feel the faint heat radiating from her. "Not just him," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not what you think I am, Jace." The sound of his name on her tongue hit him like a shockwave, soft and deliberate, and he realized he'd never told it to her. She'd heard it in the arena, maybe, or pulled it from the chaos of their escape. Either way, it rooted him to the spot. "Then what are you?" he pressed, his voice rougher than he intended. She didn't flinch, didn't pull back, just held his gaze with an intensity that made the cold air feel charged. "I know where it is," she said. "The Eclipse Sovereign. A Cathan warship. Lost, hidden, but alive. It could burn this galaxy to ash." Her words hung between them, heavy and sharp, and Jace felt a chill that had nothing to do with the station's temperature. He'd heard rumors of the Sovereign during the war. A ghost story, a weapon so powerful the Coalition had raised entire systems to bury it. If it was real, if she knew where it was, she wasn't just a slave. She was a target. Before he could respond, Kaera swayed, her hand shooting out to grip the console. Her knees buckled, and Jace lunged, catching her before she hit the floor. His arms wrapped around her, one hand splaying across her back, the other cradling her head as he eased her down. Her skin was clammy now, the violet fading to a sickly gray, the glow beneath it dimming like a star on the brink of collapse. Her chest rose and fell unevenly, her breath shallow, and panic clawed at Jace's gut. Hey, stay with me," he said, voice sharp with urgency. He shifted her in his arms, her weight light but solid against him, and her head lolled against his shoulder. Her hair brushed his neck, soft and cool, a stark contrast to the heat of his own skin, and he felt her tremble. Faint, almost imperceptible, but there. "What's happening to you?" Her eyes fluttered open, golden irises clouded with pain. "It's my kind," she murmured, each word a struggle. "We need a bond, a link. Without it, we fade." She swallowed, her throat working beneath the faint scars of her collar. "I've been alone too long. A bond." Jace's brow furrowed, his mind racing. What the hell does that mean? Her hand lifted, trembling, and rested against his chest, right over his heart. Her fingers pressed there, cool and smooth, sending a jolt through him that made his breath catch. "Something deeper," she said, her voice fading. "Spirit, body, trust." Her eyes locked with his, raw and unguarded, and for a moment he saw her. Not the fighter, not the slave, but the woman beneath, reaching for something she couldn't name. He didn't understand. Not fully, but the weight of her words sank into him, heavy and inescapable. She was dying, right here in his arms, and whatever this bond was, it was the only thing keeping her alive. His mind rebelled, screaming at him to pull back, to protect the walls he'd built around himself after the war. He'd lost too much already. His squad, his ship, his purpose. Letting her in, tying himself to her, felt like handing over the last piece of who he was. But as her hand slipped from his chest, her strength ebbing, he felt a pull he couldn't fight, a need to hold on, to keep her here. A distant boom shook the station, the viewport trembling as a flash of light streaked across the void. Jace's head snapped up, Valther's ships, sleek, predatory outlines cutting through the dark, were closing in, their cannons already warming for a barrage. The station rocked again, harder this time, as a plasma bolt grazed the hull, sending a shower of sparks cascading from the ceiling. Jace cursed, pulling Kaera tighter against him, his arm curling around her waist. Her body pressed into his, soft and fragile, her warmth seeping through his jacket despite the chill. He could feel the curve of her spine beneath his hand, the faint shudder of her breath against his neck, and it lit something inside him. Fierce, protective, undeniable. "Hold on," he growled, shifting to shield her as another blast rattled the room. Debris clattered around them, a jagged shard slicing past his cheek, drawing a thin line of blood. He ducked into a corner, pinning Kaera against the wall with his body, one hand braced above her head, the other still wrapped around her. Her hair tangled around his fingers, silky strands catching on his rough skin, and her face tilted up, so close he could feel the heat of her breath on his jaw. Her eyes, dim but alive, searched his, and her lips parted, close, too close, a whisper away from his own. The station groaned, metal screeching as Valther's ships tightened their net. Jace's heart pounded, not just from the danger, but from her nearness, her vulnerability, the way she fit against him like she belonged there. "We're getting out of this," he said, voice low, fierce. "You hear me?" Her fingers twitched against his chest, a faint nod T. The control room of the derelict station quaked as another plasma bolt tore into its hull, the impact sending a shudder through the metal that rattled Jace Carver's teeth. Sparks erupted from the ceiling, cascading like fiery rain, sizzling as they struck the floor and died in the cold. The flickering console threw jagged shadows across his face, his gray eyes narrowed against the chaos, his jaw set tight. He knelt in the corner, Kaera cradled against him, her violet skin clammy and pale, her golden eyes half-lidded with the exhaustion that clawed at his gut. The air bit at his exposed skin, frigid and unyielding, but where her body pressed into his, there was a fragile warmth, a fading ember he couldn't let slip away. Valthor's ships circled outside, their cannons painting the void with molten streaks, and time was bleeding out faster than the blood from his shoulder. Kira's words lingered in his mind. Spirit, body, trust, a riddle wrapped in desperation, a lifeline he didn't fully grasp but couldn't ignore. She was fading, her breath shallow and uneven, her frame trembling faintly in his arms. And this bond she spoke of was her only tether to life. Jace's chest tightened, a storm of conflict raging behind his eyes. He'd spent years running, from the war that took his squad, from the guilt that gnawed at his bones, from anything that threatened the walls he'd built to keep himself whole. Letting her in, binding himself to her in some way he couldn't undo, felt like handing over the last shred of control he had left. But as her head rested against his shoulder, her white hair spilling across his neck, soft, cool, alive despite everything, he knew he couldn't let her die. Not here, not like this. We're doing this, he said, voice low and resolute, cutting through the station's groans like a blade. He shifted her gently, easing her back against the wall, her legs stretching out across the cold floor. She stirred, her eyes fluttering open, and met his gaze with a flicker of something raw. Hope, fear, a quiet plea she didn't voice. Tell me what to do. Her lips parted, dry and cracked from days of silence, and her voice rasped out, rough but steady. It's not words, Jace. It's us. She lifted a trembling hand, pressing it to his chest, her fingers splaying over his heart with a touch so light it shouldn't have hit him, so hard. Yet it did, her skin smooth and cool against the worn fabric of his jacket, sending a jolt through him that made his breath hitch. Feel me, she whispered, her golden eyes searching his. Let me feel you. Jace swallowed, his pulse thudding beneath her palm, a rhythm that echoed the chaos around them. He didn't know what she meant, not entirely, but he nodded, sliding his hand over hers, trapping it against his chest. Her fingers curled slightly, nails grazing his skin through the cloth, and he felt her warmth seep into him, faint but insistent, like a spark refusing to die. Okay, he said, voice rougher than he intended, thick with something he couldn't name. Okay. She guided his other hand to her chest, placing it just below her collarbone, where the faint glow of her bioluminescence pulsed weakly beneath her skin. His fingers spread across her, soft, impossibly soft, like silk stretched over a frame of steel, and he felt the shallow rise and fall of her breathing, the erratic thump of her heart beneath his palm. She was so close now, her face mere inches from his, her eyes locked on him with an intensity that made the frigid air feel charged, heavy. Her breath brushed his lips, warm and uneven, a fleeting heat that drew him in, shrinking the space between them until it was nothing. A heartbeat, a whisper, a choice he couldn't unmake. Focus, she murmured, her voice a thread of sound weaving through the din. Reach for me. Her hand tightened over his, pressing harder, and he closed his eyes, shutting out the trembling station, the distant booms, the cold seeping into his bones. He focused on her, the heat of her skin under his fingers, the faint tremor running through her frame, the way her hair grazed his wrist, silky and wild, tickling his skin with every breath she took. Something stirred inside him, a pull he couldn't name, like a tide rising in his chest, tugging him toward her with a force that defied reason. The station bucked again, a sharper jolt that sent a shattered panel crashing down nearby, its edges glinting wickedly in the dim light. Jace barely flinched, his world narrowing to her, to the rhythm of her breath, the pulse beneath his hand, the way her presence pressed against the edges of his mind. Her voice came again, softer now, almost inside him. Yes, like that. And then he felt it. A spark, faint at first, flickering like a distant star, then flaring brighter, a thread of energy weaving between them. It wasn't just physical, not just the press of her body against his, but deeper, a warmth brushing his thoughts, vibrant and alive, like sunlight breaking through a storm. Kaera gasped, her back arching slightly, and Jace's eyes snapped open. Her skin was glowing again, the violet deepening to a rich, living hue, the patterns beneath it pulsing with renewed strength. Her hand slid up his chest, fingers curling around the back of his neck, pulling him closer until their foreheads touched. Her hair tangled around his jaw, soft and wild, spilling over his shoulders like a curtain of starlight, and her breath mingled with his, hot, ragged, so close he could taste the faint sweetness of it on his tongue. His hand on her chest tightened, feeling her heartbeat steady, strong, syncing with his own in a rhythm that made his head spin. She was everywhere, under his skin, in his pulse, a quiet echo that wasn't his but felt like it belonged there, a presence he couldn't shake and didn't want to. "Jace," she breathed, his name a tremor on her lips, and the sound sent a shiver racing down his spine, igniting a fire in his gut. Her fingers brushed his jaw, light and trembling, tracing the line of his stubble with a touch so delicate it nearly undid him. He couldn't stop himself from leaning into her, his cheek grazing hers, her skin warm now, alive, and the heat of her pressed against him, her chest rising against his, her thighs brushing his as she shifted closer, lit something fierce inside him, a longing he hadn't let himself feel in years. He wanted to pull her in, to close that last inch between them, to taste the breath she offered, but before he could surrender to it, the station screamed. A deafening blast rocked the room, the viewport shattering inward as a plasma bolt ripped through the hull with a howl of torn metal. Glass and debris sprayed across the floor, glinting like deadly stars, and Jace threw himself over Kaera, shielding her as the shockwave slammed them into the wall. His arm wrapped around her waist, pinning her beneath him, and her body molded to his soft, warm, trembling with the aftershock. Her hair caught in his fingers, silky strands tangling as he held her tight, his breath ragged against her ear, hot and uneven. The station's alarms blared, a piercing wail that drowned out everything but the pounding of his heart, a frantic rhythm mirrored by the pulse he felt through their bond. "They're here," he growled, pulling back just enough to scan the room, his body still pressed protectively over hers. Through the breached viewport, he saw them. Valthor's enforcers, armored figures rappelling from sleek dropship, their boots clanging onto the station's deck with a sound like hammer strikes. The bond had worked. Kira's color was back, her eyes bright with life, her frame steady beneath him, but it had cost him time. Too much time. He could feel her now, not just in his arms, but in his mind, a quiet strength humming through the thread that tied them together, and it sharpened his resolve. Kaera pushed against him, her hands firm on his chest, her touch sending a ripple of warmth through him despite the chaos. He helped her up, his arm lingering around her waist as she steadied herself, her frame strong now, alive with a fire he hadn't seen before. "We have to move," she said, her voice clearer, stronger, carrying a resolve that matched his own, a resolve he felt echo in his chest through their bond. She stepped close, her shoulder brushing his, and her hand found his arm, fingers curling around his bicep, cool and smooth against his skin. The touch grounded him, cutting through the haze of adrenaline and pulling him back to her. The enforcers breached the control room, their rifles raised, visors glinting under the flickering lights like the eyes of predators. "End of the line, human!" one shouted, voice distorted by a modulator, his weapon trained on Jace's chest. Jace shoved Kaera behind him, knife in hand, its blade catching the faint light with a dull gleam, but she didn't stay put. She stepped forward, her stance wide, her golden eyes blazing with something fierce, something alive, something born from the bond they'd forged. "No," she said, voice cutting through the noise like a blade, sharp and unyielding. "Not today." Her hand brushed Jace's back, a fleeting touch that sent a surge of warmth racing through him, and he felt her resolve pulse in his chest, a mirror to his own defiance. They were linked now, tied by more than just survival, and it fueled him in a way he hadn't expected. Jace lunged at the nearest enforcer, his knife sinking into a joint in the armor with a wet crunch. The brute's roar cut short as he twisted the blade and dropped him. Kaera darted to the side, grabbing a jagged shard of metal from the floor, her movements fluid and deadly, her renewed strength a testament to the bond they'd forged. A second enforcer swung at her, his rifle but arcing toward her head, but she ducked low, driving the shard into his knee with a force that surprised even Jace. The man crumpled, howling, and she rose, her hair whipping around her like a pale flame, her eyes locking with Jace's across the chaos, a silent understanding, a shared pulse that thrummed between them. More boots echoed down the corridor, heavier now, the sound of reinforcements closing in. Jace spun, grabbing Kira's hand, her fingers lacing into his with a strength that matched his own, her skin warm and alive against his calluses. "There," he said, nodding toward a narrow hallway branching off the room, its shadows offering a slim chance at escape. "We're not done yet." She nodded, her grip tightening, a quiet vow in the pressure of her touch, and they ran, shoulder to shoulder, her hair brushing his arm, soft and wild, her breath syncing with his in a rhythm that felt as natural as the stars outside. The bond hummed between them, a lifeline in the dark, stronger now with every step they took together. As they disappeared into the shadows, Jace felt it, the weight of her beside him, the fire of her spirit woven into his own, and he knew one thing for certain. Whatever Valthor threw at them next, they'd burn through it as one. The narrow hallway spat Jace Carver and Kaera into a hangar bay, its vast expanse a graveyard of twisted metal and forgotten ships, bathed in the cold silver glow of starlight streaming through a massive, cracked viewport. The station's alarms wailed behind them, a fading scream drowned out by the low hum of a salvaged fighter craft Jace had spotted, a battered relic, its hull pocked with scars but its engines still intact. He didn't pause to question their luck. He yanked the cockpit hatch open, shoving Kaera inside before sliding into the pilot's seat. His hands flew over the controls, fingers deft despite the ache in his wounded shoulder, coaxing the ship to life with a growl of thrusters that shook the dust from its frame. "Hold on," he said, voice tight, as he punched the ignition. Kaera gripped the co-pilot's chair, her violet skin shimmering faintly under the console's glow, her golden eyes sharp with a fire he hadn't seen before. The bond between them thrummed, a steady pulse in his chest, her presence a quiet strength woven into his own, and it steadied him as the fighter lurched free of the station's crumbling embrace. The viewport shattered behind them, Valthor's enforcers spilling into the hangar just as the craft blasted into the void, leaving the derelict wreck in a trail of sparks and debris. Space unfolded before them, an endless black canvas strewn with stars like scattered glass. But the beauty was a lie. Valthor's fleet loomed ahead, 3 sleek warships, their hulls glinting like predators' teeth, flanked by a swarm of drones that buzzed with lethal intent. Plasma cannons flared, painting the dark with streaks of molten red, and Jace yanked the controls hard, sending the fighter into a spiraling dive. The ship groaned under the strain, its frame rattling as a bolt grazed the wing, scorching the metal black. He gritted his teeth, his mind racing, years of piloting for the Coalition flooding back, every instinct honed by battles he'd try to forget. "They're boxing us in," Kaera said, her voice steady despite the chaos, her eyes flicking between the viewport and the sensor screen. She leaned forward, her shoulder brushing his, and the contact sent a ripple of warmth through him. her skin smooth and alive, her hair grazing his arm like a whisper of silk. He felt her through the bond, not just her words but her resolve, a mirror to his own defiance, and it sharpened his focus. "Not if I can help it," he growled, banking the ship sharply to avoid a drone's strafing run. His hands danced over the console, rerouting power to the thrusters, pushing the old craft beyond its limits. He was a human in a galaxy of monsters, outgunned and outnumbered, but that was where he thrived, where grit and cunning turned the odds into a weapon. He spotted a gap in the drone swarm, a fleeting window, and gunned the engines, threading the fighter through a hail of plasma with a precision that made the ship sing. The lead warship loomed closer, its cannons swiveling to track them, and Jace's stomach tightened. "Kaera, those guns. Can you take them?" He nodded toward the co-pilot station, its controls tied to a pair of turret mounts that still flickered green. She didn't hesitate, her hands moving to the targeting system with a grace that belied her exhaustion. "Yes," she said, voice firm, and her fingers danced over the controls, her eyes narrowing as she locked onto the cannons. The bond pulsed between them, and Jace felt her focus, a steady, burning clarity that synced with his own. She fired, twin beams lancing through the void, striking the warship's port cannon with a burst of flame that lit the dark. The ship shuddered, its aim faltering, and Jace hooped, a grin tugging at his lips despite the odds. "Nice shot," he said, glancing at her. She met his gaze, a faint smile curving her lips, and for a moment the chaos faded, her golden eyes bright, her hair catching the console's light like a halo. Her hand brushed his arm, a fleeting touch that sent a shiver through him, her skin warm and smooth against his, and he felt her pride echo in his chest. The moment shattered as a plasma bolt slammed into the fighter's rear, throwing them forward against their restraints. Alarms blared, red lights flashing across the console. Hull breach, power failing. Jace swore, wrestling the controls as the ship spun, his shoulder screaming with pain. Blood seeped through his sleeve, staining the seat, and his vision blurred at the edges. "We're hit," he rasped, forcing the words out. "Engines are dying." Kaera unbuckled, ignoring his protest, and knelt beside him, her hand steady as she gripped his arm. "You're hurt," she said, voice sharp with worry, and her fingers slid up to his shoulder, pressing against the wound. Her touch was cool at first, then warm, seeping through the fabric, and he hissed as the pressure sent a jolt of pain, and something else through him. Her hair fell forward, brushing his chest, soft and wild, and her breath grazed his neck, hot and urgent, making his pulse race despite the agony. "I'm fine," he lied, but his voice cracked, betraying him. She didn't pull away, her hand lingering, her warmth a lifeline in the cold cockpit. Through the bond, he felt her fear, not for herself, but for him, and it hit him harder than a blast. The warship fired again, a barrage that lit the void, and Jace yanked the controls, dodging by inches. The fighter groaned, its thrusters sputtering, and he knew they couldn't outrun this. "Kaera, back to the guns," he said, voice tight. "We take them down, or we're done." She nodded, sliding back to her seat, but her hand lingered on his arm, a final squeeze that left a trail of heat on his skin. She fired again, her shots precise, tearing through the drones with a ferocity that matched the fire in her eyes. But the warship adjusted, its cannons locking on, and a direct hit rocked the fighter, sending it spinning out of control. Jace's head slammed against the console, blood trickling down his temple, and the world tilted. "Jace!" Kaera's cry cut through the haze, sharp and desperate. She lunged for him, her hands cupping his face, her fingers trembling as they brushed his blood-streaked skin. Her touch was soft, warm, a stark contrast to the cold seeping into the cockpit, and her breath hitched as she pressed her forehead to his. "Stay with me," she whispered, voice breaking, and he felt her tears, hot, fleeting, fall against his cheek. Her hair tangled around his neck, silky and alive, and her body pressed close, her chest rising against his with every ragged breath. He forced his eyes open, meeting hers, and the bond flared. Her fear, her strength, her will pouring into him. Not going anywhere, he rasped, gripping her wrist, her pulse racing beneath his fingers. He pulled himself up, pain lancing through him, and shoved the controls forward. The ship stabilized barely, and he saw it. The warship's bridge, exposed after Kaera's last shot. "Finish it," he said, voice raw. "Now." She nodded, tears glistening in her eyes, and turned back to the guns. Her hands moved with a fury he hadn't seen, her voice rising in a shout. "I won't lose you." As she fired, the beam struck true, piercing the warship's bridge in a blinding explosion that shattered its hull, debris blooming like a fiery flower against the black. The drones faltered, their coordination lost, and Jace veered the fighter away, dodging the wreckage as the remaining ships hesitated. But Valthor wasn't done. A smaller craft detached from the chaos, a sleek, personal shuttle, its hull gleaming with menace. It charged them, ramming the fighter's side with a screech of metal, and the cockpit hatch tore open, exposing them to the void. Alarms screamed, oxygen hissing out, and Valthor himself emerged, his cybernetic claw glinting as he leapt into the cockpit. "You're mine, Cathan," he roared, lunging for Kaera. Jace moved faster, shoving her back and tackling Valthor, his knife flashing. The brute's claw caught his arm, twisting it until the blade clattered away, and pain exploded in Jace's chest as Valthor's fist slammed into his ribs. He staggered, blood dripping, but Kaera was there, grabbing a jagged piece of the hatch, driving it into Valthor's side with a scream of rage. "Not him!" she yelled, and the bond surged, her strength flooding into Jace. He seized the moment, wrenching a loose panel free and slamming it into Valthor's head. The brute stumbled, and Jace grabbed Kaera's hand, pulling her to the controls. Together, they fired the last turret shot, the beam tearing through Valthor's chest, sending him spinning into the void in a spray of sparks and blood. The shuttle exploded behind him, a final burst of light that faded into the dark. The fighter drifted, its systems dead, oi among the stars. Jace slumped in his seat, blood soaking his shirt, his breath ragged. Kaera knelt beside him, her hands trembling as she pressed them to his chest, her tears falling onto his skin. "You're alive," she whispered, voice thick, and her fingers traced his jaw, soft and warm, leaving a trail of heat that anchored him. He covered her hand with his, feeling her pulse through the bond, and managed a weak smile. "Yeah," he rasped, "and so are you." Her body pressed close, her warmth enveloping him, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. The fighter craft drifted aimlessly among the stars, its hull a battered shell of scorched metal and shattered circuits, suspended in the vast silence of space. The cockpit was a ruin, its hatch torn open, exposing the interior to the void, the console dark save for a single flickering light that cast a faint glow across Jace Carver's blood-streaked face. He slumped in the pilot's seat, his chest rising and falling with shallow, ragged breaths, blood soaking through his torn shirt from the wounds Valthor had left behind. The cold of space seeped in, biting at his skin, but it couldn't touch the warmth beside him. Kaera, kneeling close, her presence a tether, keeping him anchored to the living. She pressed her hands to his chest, her fingers trembling as they brushed over the gashes, her violet skin glowing faintly under the starlight that spilled through the broken viewport. Her white hair framed her face, soft and wild, catching the light like strands of spun silver, and her golden eyes shimmered with unshed tears as she looked at him. "You're alive," she whispered, voice thick with relief, and her fingers traced his jaw, light and warm, leaving a trail of heat that cut through the haze of pain. Jace managed a weak smile, his hand lifting to cover hers, feeling her pulse through the bond, a steady rhythm that mirrored his own, a lifeline he hadn't known he needed until now. "Yeah," he rasped, voice rough and faint. "And so are you." Her touch lingered, her palm pressing against his cheek, and he leaned into it, the softness of her skin a stark contrast to the cold metal around them. She shifted closer, her body pressing against his side, her warmth enveloping him like a shield against the void. Her hair brushed his neck, silky and alive, and her breath grazed his skin, hot and unsteady, stirring something deep in his chest, a quiet peace he hadn't felt in years. The battle was over. Valther's fleet, or what remained of it, drifted in pieces among the stars, their wreckage a silent testament to the fight they'd barely survived. The fighter's oxygen was thinning, its systems dead, but Jace didn't care. Not yet. For the first time in too long, he wasn't running. Not from the war, not from himself, not from her. Kaera's hand slid down to his chest, resting over his heart, and through the bond, he felt her. Her relief, her gratitude, her strength, a presence woven into him so deeply it felt like she'd always been there. "We need to patch you up," she said, pulling back just enough to rummage through a storage hatch beneath the co-pilot's seat. Her movements were steady now, her frame strong with the life the bond had restored, but her eyes flicked to him with a worry she couldn't hide. She found a medkit, old, battered, but functional, and knelt beside him again, her hands deft as she tore open a pack of gauze. "Hold still," she murmured, her voice soft but firm, and she pressed the cloth to his shoulder, her fingers brushing his skin with a care that made his breath catch. The pain flared as she worked, but her touch dulled it. Her skin cool at first, then warm as it lingered, sending a shiver through him that had nothing to do with the cold. She leaned in, her hair falling forward to graze his chest, soft and wild, and her breath brushed his collarbone, a fleeting heat that made his pulse quicken. "You're a mess," she said, a faint smile tugging at her lips, and he chuckled, the sound rough and weak but genuine. "Been worse," he lied, and her eyes met his, golden and piercing, seeing through him in a way that made his heart thud harder. She tied off the bandage, her fingers lingering on his arm, tracing the edge of the wound with a tenderness that felt more intimate than the act itself. Her hand slid down to his wrist, resting there, and he felt her warmth seep into him, a quiet promise in the press of her skin against his. The cockpit fell silent, save for the faint hiss of escaping air and the distant hum of the stars outside. Jace shifted, wincing as he sat up straighter, and Kaera moved with him, her hand never leaving his arm. She settled beside him, her shoulder pressed against his, her thigh brushing his as she tucked her legs beneath her. The bond hummed between them, a steady current that carried her emotions into him. Relief, yes, but something deeper, something that mirrored the ache in his own chest. He turned to her, meeting her gaze, and found her watching him, not with the guarded intensity of the arena, but with an openness that made the cold void feel warm. "I never thought I'd get this," she said, voice soft, almost lost in the silence. Her fingers traced an absent pattern on her knee, her eyes drifting to the stars beyond the viewport. "A chance, a future. I was disappearing piece by piece until you." She paused, her hands stilling, and when she looked at him again, her eyes were bright, raw. "Why did you do it, Jace? Risk everything for me?" He exhaled, dragging a hand through his blood-matted hair, his mind scrambling for an answer that made sense. He could have said it was instinct, or guilt, or some buried need to prove he wasn't the failure the Coalition branded him. But the truth was simpler, messier, and it spilled out before he could stop it. "Because you looked at me," he said, voice low, rough with honesty. "Back in that pit, you didn't beg, didn't break. You just looked at me like you knew I'd come. And I couldn't walk away from that." Her lips parted, a breath escaping her, and her hand reached for his, fingers lacing into his with a strength that belied her delicate frame. Her skin was warm now, smooth against his calluses, and the contact sent a jolt through him, a quiet electricity that made the stars outside seem dim. "You gave me back my life," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "and more than that. You gave me a reason to keep it." Jace's throat tightened, and he squeezed her hand, feeling her pulse through the bond, a rhythm that synced with his own, a tether he didn't want to break. He shifted closer, his arms sliding around her shoulders, pulling her against him until her head rested on his chest. Her hair spilled over his arm, soft and cool, and her body pressed into his side, her warmth seeping through his torn shirt. He could feel the curve of her beneath his hand, the steady rise and fall of her breath, and it grounded him in a way nothing else ever had. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice a whisper against his skin, her breath brushing his neck with a heat that made his heart stutter. He looked out at the stars. Their light fractured through the cracked viewport, and for once he didn't feel the urge to run, to chase the next fight, the next escape. He'd spent so long drifting, a ghost among the living, but here, with her, he felt solid, whole. "We find the eclipse sovereign," he said, his voice steady despite the exhaustion weighing him down. "Not to use it, but to keep it out of hands like Valther's." And after that, he paused, turning to her, his hand lifting to brush a strand of hair from her face. His fingers lingered, tracing the line of her cheek, her skin smooth and warm beneath his touch, and her eyes fluttered shut for a moment, leaning into him. "Whatever we want," he finished, softer now, a promise wrapped in the words. Together, her eyes opened, golden and luminous, and her lips curved into a small, knowing smile. "Good," she said, and the simplicity of it, of her trust, her faith, hit him harder than any battle ever had. She shifted, turning to face him fully, and her hand slid up his chest, resting over his heart again. Her fingers pressed there, warm and firm, and her breath brushed his lips, close enough to taste, a fleeting heat that made his pulse race. He didn't move, didn't breathe, just held her gaze as she leaned in, her face inches from his, her hair spilling around them like a curtain of starlight. Her hand slid to his neck, fingers curling into his hair, and the bond flared, her emotions pouring into him, a mix of gratitude, longing, and something deeper, something that mirrored the fire in his own chest. She didn't close the distance, not fully, but the tension hung between them, electric and alive, a promise of something more when the time was right. "Good," he echoed, voice rough, and his arm tightened around her, pulling her closer until her body pressed fully against his. Her warmth enveloped him, her skin soft where it brushed his, and he rested his chin on her head, her hair tickling his jaw with every breath she took. They sat there, tangled together in the wreckage of the fighter, the stars stretching endlessly before them, a future uncharted, uncertain, but theirs. A faint beep cut through the silence, the console's last gasp, a signal flickering to life. Coordinates, maybe, or a distress call from some distant ship picking up their drift. Jace didn't care. Not yet. He'd deal with it when the time came, when his strength returned, when the galaxy demanded something more of them. For now, he held Kaera, her hand in his, her warmth a beacon in the dark, and knew he was exactly where he was meant to be. The end, for now, but not the end of their story. Not by a long shot.